Welcome to a special edition of the Daily Dose of Theological German, where we don't do anything theological at all. In fact, we look at a topic, a common feature of the German language, which has a similar kind of parallel feature in English, and we use that to try to get our heads around some of these German concepts and ways that German does things. So today we're going to be looking at separable verbs. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is a separable verb in German? Well, a separable verb is when you take an existing verb and you put some kind of a prefix on it to nuance or sometimes drastically alter its meaning. And you can do this with a variety of different kinds of prefixes, and you will learn to recognize those patterns. In some cases, in special cases, the prefixes that you put on these verbs do not seem to want to stay attached to the verbs to which they have been affixed. And so what ends up happening is they seem to want to move around the sentence and cause all kinds of consternating headaches for people trying to read German. And so these separable ones are very often actually prepositions and not merely prefix forms. And so there's quite a variety of them, but some of them can also take the form of other kinds of words or deictic markers and things like that. But here are some examples. Let's see what happens when we use some of these examples with a particular verb. So let's take, for instance, the verb fangen, which can be modified in a variety of ways. This verb by itself typically means to catch, in the sense of to capture, something like that. So what happens when we put these different prefixes on it? Anfangen means to begin, so quite a different meaning there. Auffangen means to absorb, and you can sort of see how the semantic range could have gone in that direction. You can kind of catch or trap, you could say, water with a sponge to absorb, and so you can kind of see the semantic relationship there. Unterfangen means something like to dare, and so you can see how these work. You basically have the verb fangen, you put different prefixes on it, and you essentially get a whole set of new and different verbs that mean different things. They construe different processes altogether, and so that's how these things work. So let's take the particular example of Anfangen, which as we saw means to begin. And here's a headline that I just found somewhere on the internet, so you know it's real live German and real live use. And what does it say? Well, here we have Fulda College, 2,250 freshmen, although I think now we should have to say fresh people. Fangen, capture. Oh, what have the fresh people captured? Their studies under corona conditions. And then suddenly you're looking at this preposition dangling out here way at the end. What is this on doing? Well, it is none other than the on from Anfangen, and in fact the sentence has to be translated 2,250 fresh people begin their studies under corona conditions. Let's look at another one. So here's another German headline. When do children begin to speak? And again you have this prefix from the beginning of the word down at the end of the sentence, and we're all saying, why, German? Why do you have to do this to me? But if you ask that, then you also have to ask the same question of English, because English also has verbs which come in two parts, which just do not like sometimes to stick to each other. So let's have a look. Separable verbs in English. Of course, this is not a thing. However, in English, there are phenomena called phrasal verbs, and then grammarians in English or lexicographers or whoever they are that make all these kinds of decisions sometimes have difficulty determining whether something gets to be a phrasal verb or whether it is just the simple verb, then in a special case used with some modifier, which is often a preposition standing in isolation. And so when you look in dictionaries, you'll find these things under different kinds of categories. But nevertheless, let's look at a few things in English. We can lay out some prepositions, just like we had in German, right? So these could be, shall we say, a prefix to a verb, although in English they won't be, but we'll see how that works out. Well, we could take these prepositions and we could attach them in a similar fashion to a verb. So if you take, for instance, the verb to turn, and you can do this with any verbs, but just take to turn, and you can use any of those prepositions up there to essentially change, not just modify the verb to turn with the sense that it might carry, but actually to change the very process that's being construed by the verb, in which case you actually have a new verb. So if you take, for instance, to turn on, this has very little to do with the concept of turning in the simpler sense, but when you put on there, you essentially get a new verb, which has to do with turning on a light or something like that. It has to do with switching things. Similarly, to turn in gives you a totally different kind of verbal process that's being construed. And so you need that preposition essentially as part of the verb. And so that's why sometimes in English these are called phrasal verbs, because the whole phrase becomes a verb in itself. And as a final example, you might have the verb to turn over. Now, this is probably where you're starting to get a little annoyed with me and going, come on, man, this is not the same thing as in German. I don't see in German this verb, splitting apart and the preposition going way off somewhere with a whole bunch of stuff in between. Well, that's not totally true. Sometimes in English, you will put an object in between the kind of initial verb and the preposition that goes with it to make a phrasal verb construction. So for instance, you could say, he turned the keys over to his dad. And so you have now separated over from turned, even though they really do go together as a phrasal verb. Of course, you don't have to do it that way in English. You could say he turned over the keys to his dad. That would be a way to keep the phrasal verb intact and together. However, it's instructive to note that oftentimes, and almost all of the times in these kinds of instances, it would not sound correct in English if you had a pronoun as the object to not split that up. If you said, he turned over them to his dad, that would sound strange. You need to say he turned them over. You actually have to separate it. And so you have some kind of constraint happening in English that's quite similar in some respects to what's going on in German. But now you're getting annoyed again and you're saying, okay, fine, so the object goes in there, big deal. German puts huge phrases in between and breaks these things up, and so that's not the same thing. Surely I must still be allowed to be confused by German, must I not? No, you must not. Now, of course, I could take the phrase to turn over and make up my own examples to prove my points, but, well, that would be cheating, and it wouldn't prove anything in the end, because just because I made up a sentence doesn't mean that it's a sentence that actually works or even ever occurs in English. So it's better to find natural English language in use, and the best place to find that is, of course, the internet. Not really, but it is the most expedient. And so here we have step 3 of this recipe involving, I don't know what this is, ghee, so, this must be some kind of a Indian dish or some kind of curry or who knows what it is. But in any case, you'll see that there's this little phrase or clause down here, turn the chicken in the pan over. And so now you're starting to see something that looks a little bit more scary like German, because you have an object in here and then you have this whole entire prepositional phrase which is modifying that object, and all of that is coming in between the verb and the preposition, which belong together for the verbal process that's being construed as a phrasal verb, or you might call it in English, or a separable verb, if you like. I think that works just as well because it's all together and it can be separated, as you see in this instance here. This is looking a lot more like German. So we can take here a different phrasal verb just to make sure it's not just that one verb, but this actually happens across the board. It's common. To turn up, here I've got a snippet from a comment that was made on someone's obituary online that I found. So it's natural English in natural use, and they're reminiscing about their friend here, and they're thinking about how this one song that she really loved, and whenever she would hear it, she would turn the music on the radio up. And so you have again here this kind of separation of turn and up, which is being separated by that kind of object phrase in the middle. And so you'll notice there that the syntax is the same as the previous example, and so I will grant you that in English this happens with less types of material in between those two parts of the verb than it does in German. It seems to be typically an object and any modifiers of the object such that you would have a sort of a full object phrase that can all go in between, but that seems to be the limit, whereas in German, of course, things get a little bit more out of control. But also in German, we have another problem. These are called separable verbs. Why are they called that? In English, we don't call them that. We call them phrasal verbs, although they are separated in the sense that the two parts of the phrasal verb are separated and can be moved. In German, they're called separable because when you learn them in your vocabulary as a lexical item, they have a prefix. It's all one word, and that prefix separates then and goes all around the sentence. Well, not really, but it moves to the end. So what's going on here? Why do we have a prefix form in German? You can't do this in English. You don't have to upturn. That's not how we do it. It's to turn up. However, interestingly, if you think about our previous example, to overturn, you can do that. That actually works in English. That's a different verb. So here you can see sort of two examples in English. To overturn is where you prefix the verb with this preposition, and that's actually not separable. At least not with preserving the meaning of that verb. So to overturn is not the same thing as to turn over. So in this case, you have a separable and an inseparable English verb, let's say. It's just that with the separable case in English, it never actually attaches to the front, so it's permanently separated. In German, you have the same thing. In German, you can also have other prefix forms like this, Anfangen, which means something, it's reflexive, so it means something like to get oneself caught. Kind of ends up being sort of passive sounding in the end. That's how it usually just gets used. But the point being, that one's not separable. You will never find wer at the end of a clause somewhere. It will always stay with the verb. And when the participle is formed, and when a zu construction is formed, and all those kind of things, it will never get broken up. Verfangen. Anfangen, however, it moves off the verb to the end of the clause. So what's going on here? Is this something to do with infinitive verbs in German? Why one separates and the other one doesn't? It can't be just because it's infinitive. It must be something else. And in fact, you'll find out that the case is the separable verbs are really the same thing as a phrasal verb in English. They just get prefixed as a result, not of something to do with the infinitive or some other thing, but actually because of the word order of German sentences and where verbs have to go in certain situations, the infinitive being a key example. So let's look at how that actually works. So we can actually go back to our previous example here because the subheading of this news article, When Do Children Begin to Speak, actually has a separable verb in it down here at the end of the first clause. There's an infinitive verb, and that is separable. If that was indicative, if that was a conjugated verb, it would have to be holen something something auf. And so it's definitely a separable verb. So let's quickly translate this sentence. With targeted training, children can quickly catch up with speech development. So what's going on with this separable verb here down at the end of the clause? Well, if you were to form this sentence more sort of simply, just the basics of the clause. Kinder holen auf, okay? So children catch up. And in English, you would say the same thing. Children catch up. And so you can actually see that you have essentially the same kind of construction in German and in English. We have a phrasal verb, we call it in English, a separable verb in German, but it's really exactly the same thing. That's what's going on. Okay, so let's try to make this sentence a bit more complicated. We're going to put a prepositional phrase on the beginning with targeted training. And when you do that, of course, in German, you can't then have your subject come next. German word order already starts to dictate some things. Your verb has to be the second thing in the sentence. So you move your verb over, and your subject now is going to come in between the verb and the other preposition that makes it a so-called separable or phrasal verb. In English, it's a little more rigid. You put the prepositional phrase on the front, and then you still have subject-verb. That's still how it works. So subject-verb, and so you don't have the same kind of splitting. But we saw before that you can split it up with an object in English. So it's the German thing isn't totally weird. It's just the German word order wants verb subject, and so auf comes afterwards. Now, if we wanted to make this into a modal in English, we just put can in there. That's our modal auxiliary for what we're trying to say in this sentence. And then catch up is going to come after that. And catch up here is actually technically an infinitive now. The modal can is our conjugated verb with children as the subject, and catch up is an infinitive that complements that modal auxiliary in English. And so that's how you have the construction. And then in English, you just add the rest of the sentence after that. An adverb can come after the verb or before. But we'll put it after here, quickly, catch up quickly with speech development. So you have kind of a complement there, and your sentence is complete. Very nice, good English word order. Okay, in German, we also can do a modal construction, and it works the same way. You're going to put in a modal auxiliary, können, and in German now, you also need an infinitive to complement that, and it just so happens that holen is also the form of the infinitive for this verb. It's because it's the same as it is in the plural. And so here it is. Holen is going to also be the infinitive, but in German, it doesn't just come after what is now the conjugated verb. So it's the same thing here. This verb is now the conjugated verb, können, which is why it has the plural form there. Children is still the subject. And so now, because of the way German word order works, children's going to need to move over and come right after können, which is in second position after that initial phrase. And holen is actually going to have to move to the very end of the clause, because in German, that's how you do it. You put the infinitive complement at the end of the clause. So let's move holen to the end of the clause. And you can now start to see what's going on here. Can you not? So we just got to move Kinder back over there. And then we just have to add in the rest of the modifiers and the complement and so forth. So it's really starting to get clear, I think, what it is that's actually going on with these so-called separable verbs. Now I left a space in here because I want to illustrate one other thing. If we were to do a perfect construction in German, let's say we want to do, have caught up, something like that, then we've got to put haben in here. So we, in other words, have to change what the conjugated verb is. So this is still an auxiliary verb, but it's not a modal verb now. It's helping us to make a perfect construction. But the other way we have to make a perfect construction is that instead of using an infinitive complement at the end, it has to be a participle, and in particular, a past participle. So for this verb, the past participle has a ge prefix, geholt, so that's the form of the past participle. But it's the same thing. It has to be at the very end of the clause because that's where the complement goes in the case of a perfect construction in German. It has to go to the end of the clause. And so for the same reason as before, the auf ends up in front of it. But the auf has to go in front of the ge prefix now because holen is really still the verb. And so it's just important to see how that is that's all working. Now we do the same thing in English for this. So we put have in there as the kind of conjugated verb now, and then we change catch to caught to make the expression caught up, and caught, of course, is the past participle. It's also just the past tense, but it's the past participle of to catch, and caught up is the past participle of to catch up. And so you can see also that we didn't say have catch upped. We didn't just try to make the whole catch up thing into a participle of some kind by putting like some other morphology on it to make it into something sounding like a past participle. Catch uppin with they have catch uppin quickly with speech. We don't do that. We simply modify the part that's the verb. Up just gets to be up, and that's the same thing that's happening in German. Auf just stays auf. The verb is holen. That's actually the verb. That's the only verb here. Auf is working together with it to make a phrasal kind of verb. But holen is the verb. So holen gets the ge prefix and gets changed into geholt. And it stays off in the same way that we don't say catch uppin or catch upped. You can see how it's really just the very same phenomenon in English and German. And so the last thing that remains to happen to get us to where we actually see these things in German is that the Germans have just removed the space. And that's not altogether unsurprising because, well, they love making compound words. These words obviously go together. Auf and geholt obviously go together. And so they just remove the space. That's perfectly natural for Germans to do. And in the case of the infinitive, they also have removed the space, and that's why you get aufholen. And so now you can see that German is not all that strange, that in fact English itself is secretly German. It's just that the Germans do it much better and with more gusto. And so, as always, thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe, and especially share this video. It's a different kind of a video. It's certainly longer, but I think a lot of people will find this more instructional and helpful in the process of just learning German, learning to read German. So please do share with any friends you know that are trying to do that right now. And also let me know if there's any other topics you would like to see me cover. I can usually find some way that English does the same things as German for almost every strange feature of German. And so if you have some topic you think would be helpful, please put it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. See you next time.